Well, thanks for joining in. Good morning once again. Welcome to our weekly get-together. I am making a change to the format and the name of this time that we spend together to reflect what we have actually been doing over the past few months. That is, the meditation time period has become less and less, and the teaching time has increased. Therefore, we no longer will be doing meditation at the end of my talk, and in accordance with that, the name of this get-together is changing to Reflections on ... So with that, today I'm going to present some background information that will help us to understand who we are as humans and why in this so-called reality. So stay with me as I provide some very basic information to you as well as some new concepts. Last week, in the introduction to Advaita Vedanta, I denounced the concept of a person explicitly stating that the body, the mind, and the ego do not exist. But our discussion is not complete. I will continue discussing aspects of this illusory world for a while. We're going to remain here for a few weeks discussing the various topics that we may not have given much thought to over the years. We will move through concepts that are helpful in understanding the so-called reality we think we live in. As we've discussed before, we are dreaming while sleeping and waking. In other cultures, there are words and whole philosophies describing this dream in great detail. In the West, these dream states and this illusion have been presented in stories and poetry, plays, novels, songs, and even by some historical documents by authors and artists, but by no one we would consider an authority. And that's because Western culture has fully bought into the idea, or the ego idea, that all of this that we experience with our senses is real. So, let's take a look at something we all learned while in school. And that is, there is a progression of awareness and intelligence in the world around us. The hierarchy is defined as minerals, plants, animals, man. Remember that? Stones seem to have no awareness and no control over their environment. Scientists say they have no life. Plants, they grow and reproduce and have limited awareness in that they respond to light. Animals seem to have consciousness, which plants don't have. They can exercise limited choice, such as eating, moving, and sleeping. And certain animals even seem to display affection, like dogs and some cats. Their overall behavior, however, is well defined, so they cannot act in a manner that transcends that boundary. Thus, a lion will never be a vegetarian. A deer will always be timid, and a tiger will remain aggressive. The behavior of man, however, is vastly more complex and much more difficult to generalize. There are aggressive people and timid ones, shy people and outgoing ones. The key difference between minerals, plants, animals, and man is that man has self-awareness. We are conscious of being conscious. We are also able to change our nature. We are aware of beauty and truth. Our humanity can actually lead us to ultimate freedom, but all too often brings misery and suffering to most. Now, science, as complex and sophisticated as it is, has not done well in addressing our nature as humans or helping us to understand who we are. Oh, science studies the body, especially neuroscientists, but to figure out who we are, that's been left to philosophy and scripture. So I'm going to explain 3 qualities of nature from the perspective of 2 of those philosophies, the Vedantic and the yogic philosophies. And by the way, last week I told you about Advaita. Advaita is a school within the Vedanta philosophy, and it's known as Advaita Vedanta. So that's just a little semantic correction. Eastern yogic and Vedantic philosophies describe a simple theory, quite alien to the Western mind, which applies to this entire universe. It is said that nature is made up of 3 components or qualities. Now, those of us who are familiar with the doshas may think the 3 doshas are what I am about to talk about. but it is instead the three gunas, Gunas. Everything in the universe, alive or inanimate, contains these three gunas or attributes in varying proportions, and the relative proportions determine the nature of things. That is, whether it's mineral, plant, animal, or human. The gunas are subtle and cannot be perceived by our senses or by science, and yet they are responsible for what occurs in the seeming material world at the gross or Newtonian level. Science, were it able to detect the gunas, would describe them as forces, and that is actually how we define their effect on us. Now, there is nothing mystical about the gunas or the force they exude upon us, just as there is nothing mystical about acupuncture, even though Western science still has a problem locating where the meridians in the body are, and therefore why acupuncture works. They can't figure it out. We know the meridians exist, but they are not tangible. I can also use the feeling or the example of feelings. Sometimes how we feel is inexplicable, even though we feel what we feel. Our feelings may not be explainable or locatable. They're not locatable in the body. But since feelings are felt, they cannot be discounted as non-existent. Neither can the gunas. Now, the least of the three gunas is called tamas. Tamas. It has the characteristics of dullness, ignorance, and inaction. Can't you relate? Don't you love it? Its attributes, when it predominates in a person, are laziness, carelessness, and ignorance with a very narrow outlook on life, very dogmatic and egocentric, and often dwelling in the past. Now, minerals consist almost entirely of this tamasic characteristic, and some people are this way. The next guna is rajas, R-A-J-A-S. The guna related to activity, emotions, desires, selfishness, and passion. Plants have a little of this, but to nowhere near the extent of animals. In a person, rajas is associated with emotional behavior, desire-driven activity, and passion, deriving pleasure from money and material gain. So, for instance, successful business people are rajasic and driven by this attribute. Sattva, S-A-T-V-A, is the third and highest of the gunas. Only in a person can it constitute a high percentage of our makeup. It is associated with unselfishness, stillness, peace, truth, knowledge, wisdom, spirituality. A person who is primarily sattvic is free from attachments of the world as well as its pleasures and miseries. This person does not let outside forces affect them, while at the same time they seek truth and knowledge only to dictate how they live. Only when this guna predominates is there a chance of seeing how things really are. Now, on this planet, we are one or a combination of these three. Most of us have a predominance of the first two gunas, tamas and rajas, with some, very little at that, having sattvic traits. So if our true nature is not apparent, and remember, as we've learned, our true nature is our real self, our higher self, our spirit. So if our true nature is not apparent, then it must be hidden. It must be hidden, covered over, layered, or sheathed. Remember, again, our true nature is spirit. Did I say that enough times? For instance, we see this body and think we are the body. The body idea is essentially a covering up or layering or sheathing of our true nature. We grew up, each of us, with a body, and we got brush burns. We fell off the swing and hurt an arm or a leg. We crossed the street and almost got hit by a car, which would have injured this body and upset Mom very much. It was about the body first, and then about behavior as we seemingly became more responsible. If we grew up in an environment where we learned to lie, cheat, and steal, we might consider this our true nature. But it's not. It's a layer or a sheath covering up our true nature. Our personality traits are not who we are. Our labels are not who we are. Mom, dad, brother, sister, lawyer, farmer, etc. So the first of these layers or sheaths, the grossest, and the one with which we first tend to identify with in life, is the body. It has a name in Sanskrit and is known as Annamaya Kosha. Annamaya Kosha. Kosha meaning layer or sheath. The second layer is called the vital sheath, Pranamaya Kosha, made up of the air we breathe. After we identify ourselves as a body, the air or breath is considered the most vital component of that body. But this too is not our true nature. If we are not the body as we've learned, then we do not need to breathe. It's not something we ever consider. But at the same time, do not misjudge the statement. On this planet, the body needs the breath and needs to breathe to stay alive in the dream. Yet who we are, with capital letters, who we are, needs nothing, including the breath. Think about that. The third layer, and there's 5 layers altogether that cover up who we are. The third layer is the mental sheath, consisting of the thinking mind and the organs of perception. It is called Manomaya Kosha. It is responsible for attempting to understand and interpret the outside world. But this usually gets us in trouble because we start to overthink everything. Ever hear of the evening news? Now, remember, this sheath, the mental sheath, consists of the thinking mind. The thinking mind, as I've discussed in previous sessions, is dangerous and can cause you harm. There should be a warning. I still think this is hysterical. Anyway, it usually ignites the analytical mind, which is why it can be dangerous. And not only do you overthink everything, but you start to analyze everything. The analytical mind brings us to mid and high beta brainwave states, and that's not a brainwave pattern we should ever desire. This sheath also, however, consists of the organs of perception. That is the senses. It is this level or sheath that gets us into the most trouble, and it is this layer or sheath that we most identify with as adults. Isn't that fascinating? For those of you who have ever taken my yoga classes, you may have remembered me talking about the organs of perception, that is the senses, in particular withdrawing from the senses. I would always say that withdrawing from the senses is when life gets very interesting, because it is at this point at which we begin to learn to go from the outside world to the inside world, from the unreal to the real, learning to transcend this mental layer or sheath during that process, which we call meditation. The next covering of our true nature or real self is a higher faculty of mind that is responsible for recognition of truth versus non-truth, for discriminative abilities, and reality versus illusion. It is called the intellect, or buddhi, B-U-D-D-H-I. In silence, it knows without needing to think. This is the intellectual sheath, or Vijñana Annamaya Kosha. If only we could attain this level of mind as a starting point in our journey to know ourselves. That would be nice. So far, I have introduced 4 layers or sheaths that shield us from our true nature. There's one more. Some people who meditate have been fortunate to experience moments of the most profound peace and silence, when the mind is completely silent, absent even, and deep contentment can be felt. It is the final sheath or layer called the bliss sheath, or Anandamaya Kosha. It's the most difficult of the sheaths to transcend, to move away from, to get out of, to go beyond, because it is so blissful. Once this level is attained, most do not wish to leave. But remember, it's a sheath, a covering of that which we truly are. Yet it is such a state of euphoria. We are going to think that we died and went to heaven. We will desire to stay right there and not desire to leave. because it is so amazingly blissful. It's similar to what the Buddhists call the void. Now, for each of the 5 sheaths, I provided a Sanskrit name. Perhaps it was noticed that each of the Sanskrit names had 2 words. The last word was kosha, that means sheath. And I'm going to be talking about the first word. The first word of every one ended in Maya, M-A-Y-A. Keeping in mind that these sheaths are coverings or layers to hide us from our real self so that we won't discover the amazing beings we really are, the definition of Maya may be of interest to you. Maya literally means magic or witchcraft. It is the force used to explain how it is that we have come to be deceived into believing that there is a planet we live on, Earth, and a universe we live in, populated with separate objects, separate people, separate everything, and separate from our Creator, God. Maya is the veil that the ego made to separate us from home, heaven. And we bought it. We bought right into it. We believe it completely. We all believe we are here. We all believe we are separate from each other and from the divine. And yet, this belief is based on illusory data, the body, the mind, and the ego. Yet to hear from me that life on this planet is all a dream is, well, unfathomable, if not downright ludicrous, right? Yet not only Vedanta, the philosophy of Vedanta, but also yoga and other philosophies I haven't even mentioned, began teaching to the people of yesteryear, thousands of years ago, the unreality of this world. Not only that, but they have words for all of this, for the veil, for the coverings, for the illusion, for all of this, because they spent their time getting to know themselves rather than advancing technology for which we are ill-equipped to use, let alone master. It seems our advanced society of today isn't nearly as advanced as the people before us, because they have all this information. We're just finding out about it. This leads us to the topic of ignorance. Isn't that a good segue? What do we know about ourselves? And if interested in learning, how do we go about acquiring more knowledge? I'm talking about knowledge, not information. Knowledge, real knowledge, is of the divine. Information is of man and the ego. It is plentiful, many times inaccurate, and mostly worthless in discovering who we are. Let's face it, most information is egocentric. Now a question that arises is, if we knew ourselves objectively, who would be the subject, the seer? Who would be the knower? That's a question to ask the rest of your life. Who am I? We also need to be clear, by the way, about the distinction between knowledge and belief or mere opinion, and understand when knowledge constitutes wisdom or truth. You may enjoy this quote: "Opinion is that exercise of the human will which helps us to make a decision without information." That's by John Erskine. I thought I'd throw that in there. We are largely ignorant when it comes to spiritual matters or to knowing our real self. And just a note that when I mention spiritual matters, I'm not referring to any religions which are mainly dogmatic and ritualistic. A person may know their religion inside and out, but it doesn't necessarily bring them any closer to home. When we begin studying spiritual concepts, it can be mind-bending. As part of growing up on this planet, we learn all sorts of things in order to function in this world. And although what we learn prepares us to earn money and play video games, it teaches us nothing about finding meaning and fulfillment or answering questions that are most important. The teachings we receive as we advance from childhood through young adulthood, whether it be history, math, language, or science, do not lessen the ignorance about that which really matters. Practically speaking, the essence of our education contains nothing relative to who we are, with capital letters, who we are. Neither our education nor our methods of education serve to help us break through the limitations we feel as we become older and start to ask the deeper questions. as we start to think. Instead, as adults, more useless so-called facts are pounded into us, usually via the media that we ignorantly expose ourselves to on a daily basis. Am I painting a picture for you? Well, wait a minute, you may say. These are important components of society: history, math, English, science, vital to our education and our growth and ranking as a nation. And I say, no, they are not. They're not vital to our growth. Practically, all of education is engineered to entrench in us the belief that this is it, this is life. What you see is what you get. We are taught that the world we experience with our senses is real. It is all there is. Get a good job, earn money, and continue to cultivate the rat race we are already drowning in. In this country, education, of which the media and advertising are perhaps the most influential, increasingly promotes the value of materialism and individualism. More importantly, our entire upbringing is geared to getting us to believe that we need money, and lots of it, to be happy. Some of us, however, have figured it out and realized that the aforementioned is not a truism. Now, while it is true that we need educators, and we have a lot of them who are very, very influential to the children, it's the subjects I've been talking about that need to be addressed. Most have figured this out, or most, I should say, have not figured it out, that all what I spoke about is not a truism. For those of us who have figured it out and have these types of conversations, it's wisest to remain taciturn about any of this, because as surely as nighttime follows day, criticism will follow whenever we do not follow the pack. Like, a lot of what I say could be dumped on. And there's no question, by the way, these days that science knows more about everything than it did 100 years ago. The amount of information we now have at our fingertips has grown exponentially. Yet if we consider the nature of ourselves, who we are, what our purpose is, why we are here, and so on, there is nothing more known than there was a few thousand years ago. Philosophies provide answers to many questions, but the few who inquire are often left confused by the many differences amongst all the selections. Advaita Vedanta, which is what I am talking about mainly today, is concerned with essential knowledge. A Course in Miracles considers knowledge to emanate only from God and nothing else. So when we talk about knowledge going forward, it's with a capital K. And we are not referring to information, as there is an entire world of difference between the two. Knowledge would be something like this: God is, period. That's knowledge. Contemplate that for a few decades. Most of us do not know where to look for a reliable source that provides answers. I will say that both Advaita Vedanta and ASIM helps us to an understanding of the essential nature of all things, that is, knowledge of the absolute. But let's continue on and continue discussing thinking. Thinking is an essential tool in order to tackle the problem of ignorance. Remembering what I said before, we can overdo it and become too analytical. Remember also, it's only a tool and is to be treated with respect if we are not to injure ourselves. Thoughts are planted into our minds by parents, family, peers, teachers, even me, and they can wreak havoc or pave a smooth road ahead. Either can occur. It depends on one's level of fear and one's level of trust. And there's other factors. Once we adopt a thought given to us by another, it becomes our thought. If we become attached to it, it becomes an opinion. And if this opinion is held for a while, it becomes a belief. It's worthwhile to ask ourselves if we ever do anything to have a thought. Some people have had thoughts, original thoughts. Einstein is purported to have had one or two original thoughts. Where do the thoughts come from? Are they generated from within through effort? Do they come into existence from nothing? Evidence suggests that original thoughts come in while in an altered state, when the I is absent. That is, when the ego has temporarily checked out. Einstein received some of his most brilliant thoughts, his best downloads, while playing the violin. I'm assuming you all know that Einstein played his violin quite often. While doing so, he was in an altered state. Research shows that these patterns occur when the brain is in alpha or theta brainwave states that are achieved when meditating. Thoughts such as these arise without the ego to claim them as its own. It should be noted that the above referenced state is very different than the typical state of mind that comes about when daydreaming. Very different brainwave patterns between the two. Now, I am providing all kinds of subtle information that should help in advancing the understanding of who we are. And there's been no mathematical formulas, quadratic equations, subject, predicate, adjective, object, conjugations, or dates of war. It's pretty amazing. Now, continuing on the line of thinking, it might be interesting to know that there are different kinds of thoughts: practical, creative, and idle. Practical thoughts are purely functional. We recognize their value, take the appropriate action, and that's the end of them. Creative thoughts wake us up, solve problems, alert us to new possibilities. They enhance our lives, but we usually cannot do anything to increase their frequency. A unique case of this type of thought can lead us to our true nature, such as the sudden realization that we are one with everything and everyone. This type of thought is rare, can lead us to change our lives completely. For instance, to search for truth or embark on a spiritual path. Now, the third type and the last type of thought, idle thoughts, consume the largest part of our time and our energy. Do you see how the ego works? Idle thoughts seem to be self-sustaining, usually spreading the cloud of negativity that most get stuck in. These thoughts stem from the concept of ahamkara that was introduced in the intro to Advaita. That is, identifying with that which we are not. This is the only type of thought that causes problems and the one to be avoided. It is known as the vrittis in the yoga world, the mind chatter that never ceases and most are plagued with. In this unreal state in which we live, we would all agree that we have idle thoughts. But A Course in Miracles teaches that there is no such thing as an idle thought, that every thought is powerful. So be careful what you ask for and stop being so undisciplined that your thoughts run rampant while idling. I've given you a lot of facts, a lot of information, because I'm talking to you from the unreal, from the dream, from the illusion. So I'm going to stop here. There's more to address. There's more to address before I'm able to turn the corner, so to speak, and begin discussing a spiritual path more in depth. So next week, opinions, beliefs, memory, and other topics will be presented. Until then, your job is to begin disciplining your mind, focusing your thoughts, meditating every single day, even if only for 3 minutes. Do it first thing in the morning. Also, if not already, begin to read books that raise your vibration. If you're unsure of what to read, contact me. Okay? You have to surround yourself, inside and outside, with that which you wish to become. If you stay where you are, you will stay where you are. If you continue to do the same things, you're not going to get new results. Somehow, some way, you have to get motivated enough to create a desire that's going to catapult you upwards. And it's this movement upwards that makes life really, really interesting. So I implore you, I beg you, I ask you, jump on this bandwagon, and there's a lot of room because there's not a lot of people here. There's more than you think, but there's billions who are not doing what you're doing. Thanks everybody for joining in. Have a great day. Enjoy this beautiful sunshine. And I will see you next time. Thanks so much.